The significance of parasite control in UK beef suckler farming today is really that post decoupling of subsidy there's a lot of pressure already on cost-effective farming. Really today, with maybe a kilo of beef costing around 300 pence to produce, none of today's British farmers can afford to be losing money in producing that kilo. Feed conversion is one of the biggest factors in being efficient and cost effective in producing suckler bred calves. And during the summer grazing period, there's the potential to lose a lot of feed conversion with poorly managed parasite control.
In cattle, there are about 18 different species of gut parasites, of which the main one is Ostatagia or Ostatagia. There's one significant liver fluke, which does a huge amount of damage to the liver of grazing cattle. And there is one predominant lungworm, which creates coughing problems and symptoms similar to pneumonia, again, in grazing cattle. So there are quite a lot to think about when you're putting together a worming strategy or any protection or planning your grazing pattern.
My father moved here in 1946. Then it was just over 300 acres. We came in as a tenant, so we bought the farm in early 70s. We've also bought the farm next door in mid 80s. We also take on a lot of summer grazing, and we have got some on farm business tenancy as well. So in all, we're about 500 acres.
There are a number of different parasites they need to give some thought to. Firstly, if the cattle have been housed during the winter period, especially if they weren't treated with an appropriate ectoparasiticide around housing time, they've got to think about the fact that they might be carrying some external parasites like lice and mange. And then when they're turned out onto pasture, there's the risk that they can pick up worm infestations from larvae that are on the pasture. And by far and away the most important worm in terms of the gut is Ostatagia ostatagii, and that's the brown stomach worm. And this can cause devastating decreases in terms of production or reductions in weight gain.
One of the things that we've tried to encourage is actually weighing calves and doing regular weighings even during the grazing period, which is not an easy thing to manage with shortage of labour. But it's only by knowing what daily live weight gains are that you can work out whether groups of calves are falling below what your targets are.
Well, basically the cattle are exposed to worms as soon as they're grazing. These worms or parasites, they complete their life cycles by going through the animal, but they spend a lot of their life cycle on the pasture as well. So any animal, once it's weaned and not sucking from its mother, which would be more applicable to beef animals, once it's grazing, it is at risk of picking up these parasite burdens. So you have to regard them as at risk as soon as they're at grass.
It's a very difficult farm. Some of the bottom ground is around 500 river ground, about 500 feet above sea level, and we go up to about 1,500 up on the hill. At the moment, we're carrying about 65 single suckler cows, which we hope to increase, what we will increase, and they're put to a Limousin bull. We calve in a 9-week block in the spring. The cattle, store cattle are grazed away from home.
Well, we looked at various options. We looked for the cheap and cheerful. We looked at different products which would facilitate his programme, and Dennis said he hasn't got handling facilities out at grass. So we narrowed that down to 2 different product regimes, which would have been the bolus or the Cydectin LA 10%.
The more traditional method, and this is for most of us who have more limited land, would be we would expect to turn out our animals in the spring, to graze them on a pasture which probably had other cattle on it the year before, and we want the worms that are currently on it to be dying off. But we want to do that, the animals need to be not picking them up and not allowing the worms to cycle through them. So those animals need medication. And therefore, for that few months from turnout to probably July, you need something that works to cover them for that few months. It's either a matter of doing repeated applications of either a pour-on or an injection and having to gather them up every so often. So examples would be certain types of injection given at turnout and 2 months later. Others which don't act for as long are given at 3 weeks, 8 weeks and 13 weeks after turnout. You can see this requires labour and effort. So an alternative and a very viable one is to use one of the long-acting preparations that you give once and it will cover them for the few months. So we've got a long-acting injection of moxidectin as a feasible option, or boluses, which many people would be familiar with because they've been around for so long, which is that they are administered, swallowed, and then they release the wormer over that few months, either in pulses or continuously. So there are quite a lot of options. The long-acting ones are really very much more convenient.
In terms of treatment options, there are a variety of different application methods. Historically, people used to drench cattle in the same way as we do for sheep. We can inject cattle. In fact, nowadays it's becoming more and more common to apply pour-on wormers to cattle, and that's because they're effective, and of course they're very easy to administer. And then we've also got the long-acting options. And in terms of long-acting options, there is one particularly long-acting injection, which contains a medicine called moxidectin. You administer that to the cattle at turnout, and then provided the cattle are set stocked, they don't need to be treated again until housing time.
Gradual exposure to the parasites and their larvae does enable animals to develop immunity. So you want them to have exposure to provoke immunity, but not so much exposure that they end up with clinical disease. So we want natural immunity. We don't want to use medicines and drugs to the extent that these animals never get exposed to the parasites, because once they're not being given the drugs, they are totally, once again, naive and totally vulnerable to infection. So it's a little bit of a balancing act between the two.